Get her out. The crowd roared as security's grip tightened on Mila's shoulder. They didn't check the guest list. They just saw a woman they thought didn't belong. But as they dragged her toward the service exit, the speakers crackled with a name that turned every laugh into a scream of silence. Before diving into this story, it's worth noting a documented psychological phenomenon called unconscious bias. Studies from institutions like Yale show that even in professional settings, people often make split-second judgments about competence and authority based on appearance rather than data. In high-stakes environments, this perception gap can lead to massive corporate and legal liabilities. Today's story is a vivid example of what happens when that bias meets the person who actually signs the checks. Mila sat at the center of table 1, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the empty stage. The seat was arguably the most important one in the room, positioned directly in front of the podium, yet for the 30 minutes she had been sitting there, she might as well have been invisible. People in tailored suits and silk gowns drifted past her, their conversations humming like a hive of bees, but not a single glance landed on her. When their eyes did happen to stray toward her corner, they didn't linger. They slid right past her, the way a person looks through a window without noticing the glass. She adjusted the small, heavy card sitting in front of her. It was thick and metallic, with her initials etched into the surface in a font so precise it felt sharp. It was the only thing on the table that felt real. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the forced laughter of people who knew each other's net worth by heart. 2 women stood less than 3 feet away, dissecting the recent dip in the tech market, their elbows nearly brushing Mila's shoulder. They didn't apologize. They didn't even acknowledge that a human being was occupying the space they were encroaching upon. Mila didn't reach for the water glass or check her watch. She simply waited. She knew this brand of silence well, the kind that isn't empty, but waited with an unspoken consensus. To the people in this room, she was a logistical error. She was a glitch in the visual landscape of a high-stakes charity gala. They saw her black dress, the neat braids coiled at the top of her head, and the stillness of her posture, and they concluded she was part of the staff, or perhaps a guest assistant who had arrived early to hold a spot. A waiter moved through the rows, placing appetizers with practiced efficiency. He served the man to Mila's left and the empty chair to her right, then paused, his eyes darting to her face for a split second before he moved on to the next table entirely. He didn't offer her a plate. He didn't ask if she needed anything. It wasn't an oversight. It was a decision made in real time, based on the atmosphere of the table. Mila watched a man in a silver tie lean over to whisper something to his wife. He pointed toward the stage, then his fingers shifted slightly, indicating Mila. The wife didn't nod or smile. She just tightened her lips and looked away, as if looking too long might validate Mila's presence. The message was clear. In a room where every seat cost more than a year's rent in most cities, Mila was perceived as someone who had slipped through the cracks. She was the only person at table 1 without a drink, without a conversation partner, and without a greeting. She sat in the loudest kind of isolation, waiting for the moment the room would finally be forced to see her. The silence around Mila snapped when a shadow fell across the table. A woman in a dark red dress, clutching a small designer bag, stopped directly in front of Mila's chair. She didn't wait for an opening or offer a greeting. She simply stared at Mila, as if she were looking at a stain on a clean shirt. Behind her stood a man in an expensive but poorly fitted light gray suit, his face already set in a scowl of annoyance. "You're in the wrong place," the woman, Sarah, said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was sharp and loud enough to make the people at the neighboring table pause their conversations. Mila didn't flinch. She looked up slowly, meeting Sarah's eyes with a neutral expression that seemed to aggravate the woman even more. Mila didn't say anything, which only fueled Sarah's momentum. "This is table 1. These seats are reserved for people who actually contributed to the foundation." The man stepped forward, pointing a finger toward the stage and then down at the chair Mila was occupying. "She's right. This specific seat is for the keynote speaker and the primary donor. It's not a general admission area." He looked around for a waiter or a staff member, his frustration visible. "I don't know how you slipped past the check-in desk, but you can't just pick the best seat in the house because you like the view. Mila glanced at the platinum card sitting on the table in front of her. The card says MJ, she said, her voice steady and quiet. Sarah let out a short, mocking laugh that drew more eyes toward them. MJ? What is that supposed to mean to us? My husband and I have been board members for 3 years. We know everyone who belongs at this table, and we've never seen you. She leaned down slightly, her perfume cloying and heavy. Maybe you're looking for the staff lounge? Or perhaps the balcony. This is for the elite, not for people playing dress up for a night. The husband shook his head, looking at the people nearby, as if seeking their approval. It's embarrassing, really. You think if you sit here long enough, you'll just blend in? People paid $50,000 a plate to be in this section. You're taking up space that belongs to someone who actually matters to this event. A few people at table 2 started whispering, their phones beginning to appear in their hands. They weren't checking emails, they were angling their cameras. Sarah saw the attention and leaned into the performance. I'm going to make this simple for you, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cold tone. Get up now, walk away, and maybe nobody will report you for trespassing. But if you stay in that chair one more second, I'm calling the manager, and I promise you, they won't be as polite as I'm being. Mila didn't reach for her bag or prepare to stand. She simply adjusted her posture and looked back at the empty stage. I think you should call the manager, Mila said. I'd like to speak with Davis Hall anyway. Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of the name, but she didn't stop to wonder how Mila knew it. She only saw it as a challenge. Fine, Sarah snapped. If you want to be humiliated in front of everyone, that's your choice. She turned to her husband. Go find Davis. Tell him we have a squatter at table 1. Davis Hall arrived at table 1 with the hurried, self-important stride of a man who dealt in emergencies. He held a digital tablet in his left hand, but it remained tucked under his arm, the screen dark. He didn't look at the device, and he didn't look at the guest list. He looked at Mila. Is there a problem here? Davis asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided there was. Sarah pointed a manicured finger at Mila, her voice rising to ensure the nearby tables could hear every word. Davis, thank goodness. This woman is refusing to move. She's claiming this is her seat, but we both know who is supposed to be sitting at table 1. She doesn't even have a proper name tag. Davis shifted his gaze back to Mila. He took in the details of her appearance in a single, sweeping second. Her age, the style of her hair, the lack of an entourage. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask her name. He relied on a mental shortcut he had used his entire career to categorize people. To him, Mila didn't look like a donor who had just wired 7 figures to the foundation. She looked like a complication. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stand up, Davis said, his voice dropping into a practiced, authoritative bass. Mila didn't move. She kept her hands folded in her lap. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Mr. Hall. If you check your seating chart for the foundation's primary partner, you'll see that. Davis felt a flicker of annoyance. He didn't like being told how to do his job, especially not by someone he had already mentally dismissed. He gripped the edge of the table, leaning in slightly to create a sense of pressure. I know my seating chart by heart. I spent 6 months organizing this gala. We have very specific security protocols for the VIP section to ensure our high-value guests feel comfortable. He glanced at Sarah and her husband, giving them a small, reassuring nod that signaled he was on their side. You aren't on my list of expected arrivals for this table. Now, you can either walk out with me quietly, or I can make this a formal security matter. I'd suggest the first option. He still hadn't touched the tablet. The answers were less than 6 inches from his fingers, stored in a database of names and photos. But Davis was blinded by his own certainty. He saw a woman who didn't fit his internal image of power, and he decided his gut instinct was more reliable than the data. He straightened his tie and signaled to a security guard standing near the wall. He was so sure of his mistake that he didn't even notice the small, engraved platinum card sitting right in front of him. He was about to set a chain of events in motion that he couldn't take back, all because he chose to trust his bias over his own records. The air in the room changed as the confrontation moved from a private dispute to public entertainment. Guests at the neighboring tables didn't turn away or look down in embarrassment. Instead, they shifted in their seats to get a better view. The first few phones went up quietly, held at chest level, but within seconds, dozens of glowing screens were aimed directly at Mila's face. There was a collective thrill in the air, the kind that happens when a crowd realizes they are about to witness someone's downfall in real time. A man 2 seats over leaned back, his phone held high to capture the entire scene. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that seemed to give the rest of the room permission to join in. The laughter started in small pockets, short, sharp bursts of amusement at the audacity of the woman who thought she could sit at table 1. Sarah, sensing the crowd was behind her, played to the cameras. She gestured toward Mila with a theatrical wave of her hand, her voice carrying a mocking lilt that invited everyone to share in the joke. "Look at the confidence," Sarah said, glancing at a nearby camera. She really thought she could just blend in if she sat still enough. The comment drew a fresh wave of snickering from the group behind her. No one stood up to ask for clarification. No one suggested that Davis Hall actually opened the tablet he was holding to verify the guest list. Instead, the room became a gallery of spectators, each person more interested in capturing a viral moment of justice than in the truth of the situation. +3. Mila looked around the circle of faces. She saw people she had corresponded with via professional emails, people who claimed to be champions of the Foundation's mission, and people who marketed themselves as leaders of industry. All of them were watching her through 5-inch screens, their thumbs ready to hit upload. The silence of those who didn't laugh was just as heavy as the noise of those who did. Not a single person stepped forward to intervene or even ask Mila for her name. They had already reached a consensus based on the scene Davis and Sarah were painting. Mila remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she let the crowd's behavior document itself. She wasn't just the target of their ridicule, she was the witness to their character. Davis Hall didn't wait for Mila to respond again. He looked over her head and gave a sharp, downward nod to the security guard who had been hovering a few feet away. The guard, a tall man with a radio earpiece and a face that showed no hesitation, moved in instantly. He didn't ask Mila to move. He simply placed a heavy, firm hand on her shoulder and the other on the back of her chair. "Time to go, ma'am," the guard said. The physical contact was the signal the room had been waiting for. A few people cheered, and Sarah let out a triumphant, "Finally." Mila felt the pressure of the guard's hand, a clear indication that if she didn't stand, she would be lifted. She didn't struggle. She didn't grab the edge of the table or shout for help. She rose slowly, with a deliberate grace that seemed to unsettle the guard for a brief second, though he didn't let go of her arm. As she stood, Mila didn't look at the phones recording her or at Sarah's smirking face. She kept her eyes locked on Davis Hall. She watched the way he adjusted his cufflinks, the way he refused to meet her gaze directly, and the slight, nervous twitch in his jaw. She wasn't looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with a cold, analytical focus, as if she were memorizing every line of his face for a future deposition. Davis cleared his throat and stepped back to make a path. "Escort her through the service in trance," he instructed, his voice loud enough to reassert his authority to the crowd. "We don't need any more disruptions to the evening's program." The guard began to steer her away from table 1. The path to the exit felt a mile long. Every few feet, a new phone was thrust into her peripheral vision. Mila walked with her head high, her pace steady. She didn't look like a woman being kicked out. She looked like a woman who was precisely where she intended to be. Behind her, she heard the scrape of chairs as Sarah and her husband finally sat down in the seats they hadn't paid for. Davis Hall followed a few steps behind the security detail, eager to see the problem fully removed from the building. He thought he was finishing a task, but as Mila glanced back one last time before the service door swung open, the look in her eyes suggested she was only just beginning. The security guard's hand was still heavy on Mila's arm as they reached the heavy double doors of the service exit. Davis Hall followed closely behind, already pulling his phone out to coordinate the next logistical task, his face showing a mix of relief and annoyance that the incident was finally over. The crowd's laughter was a dull roar behind them, a soundtrack to what they assumed was a successful purging of an unwanted guest. Then the house lights dimmed, and a sharp feedback hum cut through the ballroom. The voice of the gala host, a well-known local news anchor, exploded through the high-fidelity speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for the most important moment of the evening." Davis stopped in his tracks, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. The security guard hesitated, his grip on Mila loosening just a fraction. They were 10 feet from the service corridor, halfway into the shadows, but the host's voice held a frantic, searching energy that made everyone freeze. "Tonight is about more than just charity. It's about the visionaries who make our work possible," the host continued, his voice echoing off the walls. "We are honored to have with us the woman whose foundation didn't just donate to this event. They underwrote the entire evening and the next 3 years of our operations. She is our Woman of the Year, our keynote speaker, and the new majority partner of the Meridian Group." Mila stood perfectly still, her back to the stage, her eyes still fixed on the exit doors. She could hear the rustle of 500 people shifting in their seats, the sudden silence of the phones that had just been recording her humiliation. "Would you all please stand and welcome the CEO of the Johnson Legacy Foundation," the host shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "Please join me in welcoming Ms. Mila Johnson to the stage." The spotlight didn't hit the stage. It began to sweep the room, a frantic white beam searching the VIP section. It cut across table 1, illuminating Sarah and her husband, who were looking around with confused, expectant smiles. Then, the beam swung toward the back of the room. It caught the gold trim of the service doors and then locked onto the small group standing in the shadows. The light was blinding. It hit Mila squarely, turning her black dress into a silhouette against the white glare. The security guard's hand dropped from her shoulder as if he had been burned. Davis Hall's face went a sickly shade of gray, his jaw dropping as he looked from the stage to his darkened tablet, and finally to the woman he had just ordered out of the building. The entire gala fell into a silence so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The host stood at the podium, his hand extended toward the back of the room where the spotlight had finally settled. "There she is," he said, his voice beaming with a pride that was about to turn into horror. "Ms. Johnson, we were worried you'd been delayed." Davis Hall stood frozen in the spill of that spotlight. The physical blow of the realization seemed to knock the air out of his lungs. He looked at the security guard, whose hand was still hovering near Mila's arm, and then back at Mila's face. The blood drained from his features so quickly he turned a ghostly, translucent white. He tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. He was a man who prided himself on managing every variable, yet he had just physically evicted the woman who owned the ground he stood on. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The guests at table 1, including Sarah and her husband, turned in their seats, their faces twisting from smug amusement to a mask of sheer terror. Sarah's hand, which had been raised to point and mock just moments ago, dropped to her side as if paralyzed. The phones that had been recording the squatter were slowly lowered, one by one, as the owners realized they hadn't been filming a trespasser. They had been filming their own professional suicide. The host's smile began to falter as he noticed the scene. He saw the security guard's uniform, the proximity to the service exit, and the way Mila was positioned as if being pushed through the door. The microphone picked up his sharp, audible intake of breath. The silence was so heavy it felt violent. No one moved. No one coughed. The only sound was the low hum of the speakers and the distant, muffled sound of a kitchen worker dropping a tray behind the service doors. Mila didn't move toward the stage. She stood perfectly still in the center of the light, letting the weight of the moment press down on everyone in the room. She watched Davis Hall's eyes darting around, looking for a way to undo the last 10 minutes. There was no apology large enough, no explanation fast enough to bridge the gap between how he had treated a trespasser and how he was now expected to treat a CEO. The realization had spread through the ballroom like ice across a lake, freezing every guest in their tracks, leaving them to stare at the woman they had all collectively decided didn't belong. Mila turned away from the exit without a word from the security guard, whose hand had dropped to his side, as if the very air around her had become electrified. She walked back toward table 1, her footsteps the only sound in a room that had moments ago been filled with the noise of a digital mob. As she approached, Davis Hall tried to scramble toward her, his hands shaking as he reached for the tablet he had ignored. His mouth moved, forming silent, desperate apologies, but Mila didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She walked past him as if he were a piece of the architecture she had already decided to renovate. Sarah and her husband were still standing by the chairs they had claimed, their faces frozen in a look of profound, sickening realization. When Mila reached the table, she didn't ask them to move. She simply stood there. The husband practically fell over his own feet, trying to clear the way, pulling Sarah back by the arm. The triumph that had radiated from them minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by the panicked breathing of people who knew they had just broadcasted their own cruelty to the world. The host hurried down from the stage, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and sheer panic. He didn't go to Mila first. He went straight to Davis Hall. The microphone in the host's hand was still live, and his voice hissed through the speakers, making every person in the ballroom a witness to the finality of the moment. "What were you thinking?" the host demanded. Davis tried to stammer out a response about protocol and verification, but the host cut him off with a single, sharp gesture. "There is no protocol for what you just did. Your employment with this venue and your affiliation with the Meridian Group ended the second you put your hands on her. Clear your things and leave through the back." Davis stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, looking around at the 500 people who were now recording his exit instead of Mila's. He looked at the security guard, but the guard looked away, already stepping back to distance himself from the disaster. Without a word, the man who had been the protector of the gala turned and walked into the shadows of the service corridor he had tried to force Mila into. Mila sat down in her original seat at table 1. She picked up the platinum card, turned it over, and placed it back on the table. She didn't look at Sarah, who was now trembling, or at the host, who was waiting for a sign of what to do next. She simply looked at the room and waited for the silence to finish what it had started. Mila stood up from her seat and walked toward the stage. The silence followed her, heavy and suffocating. As she reached the podium, the host stepped aside, his head bowed, not daring to meet her eyes. She didn't look at the notes prepared for the keynote. She didn't need them. She adjusted the microphone, the slight mechanical click echoing through the hall like a gunshot. She looked out at the sea of faces, the same people who had just been laughing, the same hands that had been holding up phones to capture her eviction. Now, those hands were tucked away, and the eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and forced reverence. "Tonight, according to the screens in the lobby, we raised $2 million for the foundation," Mila said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger they expected, which made it far more terrifying. "That is a significant amount of money. It will build schools, it will fund clinics, and it will support families." She paused, letting the numbers hang in the air before she continued. "But as I sat at table 1, watching this room, I realized something. You can buy a seat at a table, but you can't buy the character required to sit there." She looked directly at the spot where Sarah and her husband were trying to shrink into their chairs. "I watched a manager decide I was a criminal because of a glance. I watched a guest demand my removal because she felt her presence was more valuable than mine. And most importantly, I watched 500 of the most influential people in this city film it while they laughed." Mila leaned closer to the mic. "Your money is good, and the foundation will use it. But do not mistake your donations for decency. This room is full of wealth, yet it is morally bankrupt. You didn't stay silent because you were confused. You stayed silent because you enjoyed the spectacle of someone you deemed lesser being humbled." She didn't wait for applause. She didn't offer a concluding smile or a call to action. She simply turned and walked off the stage. The host didn't move to take her place. The orchestra, which had been scheduled to play a celebratory finale, remained frozen. Mila walked through the center of the room, the crowd parting like a receding tide. No one reached out to shake her hand. No one offered a hollow apology. The silence she left behind wasn't peaceful, It was a prison. It was the sound of 500 people realizing that their true selves had been caught on their own cameras. And for once, there was no way to edit the footage. She reached the main doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the night, leaving the elite to sit in the quiet they had built for themselves. Mila's story is a stark reminder that true power doesn't need to shout, and real dignity cannot be taken away, it can only be revealed. In a world obsessed with status and snapshots, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the person who refuses to play the game by your rules. If this story made you think about the weight of silence and the cost of prejudice, don't just scroll past. Hit the like button to support stories that challenge the status quo. In the comments, tell us, at what point did you realize the room had made a fatal mistake? For more stories where quiet strength meets loud consequences, subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss our next dive into the moments where the truth finally stops being invisible